Okay, welcome everybody. I see we've got around a dozen people. This will be posted later, but the advantage for everybody who's joined is that you can pose questions to Dave. This is our guest speaker today, Dave Marmorek, and I'm actually going to share an image from his website as his introduction. So this is Dave Marmorek. Dave worked on the Site C EIS. Dave was the fisheries biologist, and if I remember correctly, that means you were the author of Appendix P Part 3 and possibly other appendices as well, but that was the fisheries appendix. That's where I got to know Dave. Dave is a very interesting environmental scientist. He does other things besides fisheries biology. His talk today is about adaptive management. I got to know Dave during the Site CEIS about 7 years ago or so, and since then I've come across his name on several papers about adaptive management. So adaptive management is something that is generally done following an EIS, and it's done to allow a project to proceed in the face of uncertainty. And Dave will tell you a lot more about it, particularly in the face of climate change. So here's his bio if you'd like to go look him up on his website, ESSA.com, as he is a principal at a company called ESSA. And with that, I'll be sharing his presentation.
Okay, well, thanks, Jerry, for that intro. And as a way of background, ESSA began in 1979, so we've been around for 4 decades. And so we bring together people, science, analytical tools to help people address various environmental problems. I'm an aquatic ecologist, also a modeler, and I think that's where Jerry and I started interesting the most. And I work mostly as an aquatic ecologist on how to recover species at risk, restoring river ecosystems, and applying tools of adaptive management. But it also comes into, as Jerry was just saying, dealing with some of the uncertainties in environmental impact state assessments, both uncertainties in predictions and uncertainties in the effectiveness of mitigation. And I think historically, proponents didn't want to acknowledge uncertainty, and they still don't actually, but they're sort of forced to because it's out there. And so that's led to adaptive management being a component. Some quite large environmental impact statements or assessments now have adaptive management plans as a component. Sometimes they're called environmental effects monitoring plans. They use other terminology, but it's essentially the same thing as monitoring around the key uncertainties to figure out what you might adjust in either the project or the mitigation associated with the project. And at the same time, as we're all aware, climate change is going on. And so some of my co-authors for this presentation and also for a paper which I sent to Jerry, and I assume he's circulated, they work a lot in helping communities and governments adapt to climate change, both in North America and internationally. And so these are somewhat diverse fields, adaptive management and climate change adaptation. And this talk melds that together. And we kind of see that those two fields, as well as environmental impact assessment, are all, circles in the Venn diagram that need to come together when you're doing a large scale EA. So Jerry, go to the next slide. So what is adaptive management? So this is a definition. It's the one that we use: a rigorous approach for designing and implementing management actions to maximize learning about critical uncertainties that affect decisions while simultaneously striving to meet multiple objectives. So there's a lot of words in there. Rigorous means careful experimental design to test hypotheses, selection of appropriate monitoring protocols, thorough data analyses, and this could be related to evaluating the predictions of an impact assessment, which may have a lot of uncertainties, and what decisions that could affect could be adjustments, for example, to dam operations, habitat enhancements, fish passage mitigation in the case of something like Site C. It's unlikely that the results of adaptive management studies are going to result in the removal of a dam, but actually dam removals of older dams are happening all over the place, and we're involved in one in the Klamath Basin, which would involve removing 4 old dams and allowing salmon to reaccess habitat they haven't been able to for about 50 years. So, so it all comes down to what are the critical uncertainties, what are the decisions for which information from adaptive management study might be helpful. So next slide.
Can I jump in just for a sec before I go to that next slide?
Sure.
So the students who are watching this right now have an assignment where they'll be looking back through the Site C EIS, and they'll be looking at specific technical disciplines. And one of the things they'll do is look at around a dozen different elements of the EIS and how well it was done compared to best practices, compared to the EIS guidelines, etc. And so adaptive management is one of those things that they'll need to be evaluating. And so you mentioned rigorous, and that's a really key word here, because in a lot of EIAs or EISs, you'll see that proponents have made statements about how they will adaptively manage things in the future without any real clear plan for how that adaptive management will be done. And that's often just known as sort of ad hoc management, even though people will refer to it as adaptive management, although they're referring to it incorrectly. And this is one of the major criticisms of how adaptive management has been done in the past. And so for the students who are looking at this right now and will be looking through an EIS, that rigorous is a really key word. So have they committed to a rigorous plan and they've laid out what that plan is and they actually understand what they'll be doing? Or have they just simply made a statement that they'll adaptively manage without any real clear understanding of what that means?
Wow, I agreed with everything you just said, Jerry. That was very well stated. Adaptive management is sort of become a plastic word, and so many people say things like, hey, we'll try this. If it doesn't work, we'll try something else. We're adapting. So the EIS actually isn't the place where you'll find a lot of the work that went into the adaptive management planning. There's some subsequent work that we did with BC Hydro and others, many others did. There's a whole bunch of monitoring plans, post-project monitoring plans. And there's also, we developed a diagnostic tool, which essentially said, going forward, if you had this set of outcomes, let's say bull trout are not, the abundance of bull trout spawners has declined, and you're not seeing many showing up at the passage facility at Site C, what would you conclude was happening? So we basically tried to work with them in building a diagnostic tool that said, if you learned A, B, and C, what would you do? So there's other documents outside of the EIS, and I think they're public.
I'm guessing those will be on.
Details.
Yeah, I'm guessing they'll be on the SIA registry or the BCEAO registry, which I'll be going through later in the semester. Hopefully they're on either one of those two registries.
Yeah, I'm not sure, but let me just make a note here. There's a nice summary of all the monitoring plans as well, because it, pouring through 15 or 20 detailed monitoring plans would be pretty tedious, but there's a nice executive summary of that. I'll ask Brian Ma, my colleague at ESSA, about these things and whether they are public. But anyway, so
sorry to digress, but
anyway. No, it's not. It's not a digression. It's a great comment, and I'm glad you made it. So, right. So, so these are the 6 steps of adaptive management. You can read more about it elsewhere. Essentially planning, doing, and learning. And the level of rigor in conducting those steps varies widely depending on many factors, which I'll describe shortly. So next slide. Right, so this is an animated slide, Jerry, so you can just start clicking away. So we're in the era of climate change, and these are some of the things that are happening that are making predictions much more uncertain, including predictions in EIAs. That's fine, yeah. So what does that have to do with environmental impact assessment? So ideally, EIAs should examine the cumulative effects of a project together with other past, present, and future projects, as well as the effects of climate change. Now, that's my view. The regulations are a bit more, at least historically, have been a bit more constrained in terms of how they describe cumulative effects. I won't get into that rabbit hole. But EIA guidance is being revised under the new Environmental Assessment Act by the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada. There's a technical advisory committee that's looking at what do we mean by cumulative effects and how do we assess it. One of my colleagues co-chairs that technical advisory committee. So, getting ahead of the game, I think it's worth just thinking this way, thinking broadly about environmental impact assessment in the context of climate change, in the context of past, present, and future projects. Next slide. So what is the overlap between adaptive management and climate change adaptation? So what can adaptive management do to assist us in adapting to climate change, which is obviously happening? And are the approaches used by adaptive management to address uncertainty applicable to climate change adaptation? What are the limitations of these methods? And then conversely, how does climate change affect ongoing efforts to recover species and ecosystems using adaptive management? What are the challenges created by climate change, which are likely to affect those ongoing efforts? How can we mitigate the threats of climate change and take advantage of the opportunities? So next slide.
And I'll just interject that I really like your Venn diagram here.
Oh, good. Yes, well, I suppose if it were scaled larger, the AM cycle would be a lot bigger, 8,000 miles in diameter. So, Niels Bohr, the physicist, once said, prediction is very difficult, especially about the future. And in a highly uncertain future with conditions far beyond the historical record, a predict then act model is no longer appropriate. We have to be much more proactive. So the Calgary floods in 2013, Oroville, California had some huge floods in 2017. Those were both driven by rivers of water vapor, many times the volume of the Mississippi River at its delta, that stalled and turned into rain for many days, melting snowpacks causing tremendous damage. In the case of California, these floods came after 5 years of drought. You'll be hearing more about examples of that. So with very fast flips between extreme droughts to extreme floods, in some cases simultaneously, like in Queensland a few years ago, 60% of Queensland was under extreme drought and 60% was under extreme flood, and that may seem like it adds up to 120%, but that's because some areas were having both. So if you're based only on historical climate and flow records, it's doomed to fail. So next slide, Jerry, I think you have to click twice. Right, so you can read this faster than I can recite it, but here are the core elements of an adaptive management mindset. Systems thinking, focusing on uncertainties, collaboration, rigorous monitoring, learning, adjusting actions, implementing contrasting interventions to test hypotheses. You can't really test a hypothesis without some kind of contrast over time or space, or ideally both. So this is very different from an engineering mindset, not to be critical of engineers, but let's say former engineering mindset, which was focused on estimating uncertainty and then just adding a safety factor and then designing to that threshold. So you need to be much more imaginative than that, given that we're going beyond what we've seen historically. So next slide. So what does it take to keep this adaptive management learning cycle moving forward at different scales under climate change? Next slide. So it takes a lot of gears, and if you think about a bicycle, the institutional gears are the front sprocket on the right-hand column of this table. So without those institutional gears, adaptive management just doesn't move forward. And these attributes of institutions are what's been found to be the key attributes for effective implementation of adaptive management. But without the technical gears on the left side of this table, which is sort of the scientist's happy place, there's very little ability to navigate the many scientific challenges along the adaptive management path. So you have to have solid lines of evidence to be able to convince a wide range of stakeholders about the best way to move forward. Next slide. So key point number 2, both adaptive management and adapting to climate change gets harder as the spatial scale increases. So as you move on the x-axis of this graph from farms, stream reaches, small basins, large basins, planet Earth, it gets much more difficult technically to create contrast in your actions, to replicate treatments. Farmers have been practicing adaptive management for years with replicated field plots receiving different treatments, say like fertilizer, and they get a rapid response within 1 or 2 years. So, but as you move from farms to stream reaches to small basins to large basins, the technical aspects become more difficult. It's much harder to create those contrasts and replications, and obviously we haven't yet discovered a replicate planet Earth. Institutionally, as the spatial scale increases, it becomes more and more difficult to find consensus among stakeholders. The groups become much too large for meaningful work to get done. And I'll be giving you some examples of that. Next slide. So key point number 3, climate change brings both challenges and opportunities for adaptive management and human adaptation. So I don't want to sugarcoat the challenges of climate change. The impacts on communities, on ecosystems are devastating. But as a hopefully resilient species, we need to look forward. We need to respond to those challenges. So you can read this fast and I can say it, but for each of the challenges on this slide, there are also opportunities. So I'll just quickly review some of this. So big floods, big flows, they can have devastating impacts, but they can also create habitat. They can also test hypotheses. They can lead to long-term improvements in floodplain management. Droughts really constrain what you can do, but they force very long overdue efforts at water conservation. And as I said earlier, historical flow records are inapplicable to the future. Global circulation model runs are far too coarse. So there are these opportunities for bottom-up approaches to climate risk assessment, which basically look at when would your system of management break? What are the boundaries beyond which you just can't operate? And then what do you do about that? What's your plan B or plan C? Another challenge is this rapid change from a normal year into an extreme year. And I'll give some examples for the Okanagan, close to where you folks are. And that leads to an opportunity for real-time tools for flow management decisions on a very fast time scale, which can mitigate, not necessarily eliminate, some of the risks and impacts. Climate change makes already difficult problems even harder. That's true. But exploring extreme scenarios and what we do in those situations can lead to more creative management approaches, thinking outside various boxes. Next slide. So now, in the best of scientific traditions, I'm going to cherry pick some evidence to support my thesis. Next slide.
Another Okanagan reference?
It could be. I'm not sure if any of these slides are from the Okanagan, but I am seriously addicted to Okanagan cherries and nectarines. I'll admit that. Not at this time of year, but anyway. So I'm going to talk about 5 recent river basin adaptive management projects over the last couple of decades. The Okanagan, the Missouri, Platte River, the Trinity River, and the Russian River. And you can see here the states or provinces where these are located. It's going to be a really quick tour. Each of these case studies involve collaboration with many excellent geomorphologists, engineers, biologists, stakeholders, to whom I'm very grateful. Next slide. So the basin areas vary from the Russian River at about 4,000 square kilometers to the Missouri at about 1.4 million square kilometers, deliberately chosen to illustrate the increasing challenges of both adaptive management and climate change adaptation. I can add environmental impact assessment as the basin area increases. So I'm going to start small and work up. Next slide. So the Russian River is in Northern California. It is a fairly small basin, and the area that we were looking at is even smaller. It's a portion called Dry Creek. And because there are endangered species, specifically Chinook salmon and coho salmon, the entity, the Sonoma County Water Agency that uses water out of Dry Creek as a domestic water supply was compelled to do a habitat enhancement project. So they're creating side channels, alcoves, other habitat features to improve the survival of juvenile salmon, the spawning success of adult salmon, and the habitats provide the work provides spawning and rearing habitats as well as refugia from occasional storms. And so the habitat enhancement sites are carved out of land adjacent to Dry Creek with a generous collaboration of vineyard owners who have given up portions of their land. Above the Dry Creek, there is a dam and reservoir, Warm Springs Dam and Lake Sonoma Reservoir, which are shown by the red line on the slide. And usually they keep flows between below 120 cubic feet per second. So I guess you would divide by, what, 27 to get that into cubic meters per second, something like that. And so we're looking at, pretty small, 4 or 5 cubic meters per second. And but big winter storms can happen. So the habitat enhancement sites were designed to evolve with flows rather than being fixed in place. They knew that occasionally big flows would happen that were more than what the reservoir could store. And up until the fall of 2016, the constructed habitats were being very well utilized by both juvenile and adult salmon. So next slide. So from 2013 through 2015, there was an extreme drought in Northern California. These are the flow data from the USGS site. It's somewhat hard to read the x-axis or y-axis rather, but basically it went up to 10,000 cubic feet per second. So about 40 to 50 times higher than what they typically are. And you can see a bunch of flooding in the pictures there, a road, or actually it's a bike path heading into a river. And so how has those extreme events affected the efforts to enhance the habitat? So next slide. So for the most part, the habitats were designed to accommodate high flows, and most of the features withstood those flows. So an alcove, you can think of an alcove as you're going downstream in Dry Creek, and we got to kayak it, which was really fun. An alcove is something where there's an area that is like a refuge, as you're going downstream, you can sneak into it and move a little bit up to a higher elevation. But essentially, the river doesn't go into the alcove from the upstream end. It only enters it from the downstream end, which is an important distinction. So the bottom picture here is after the flood had receded, and the top picture is during the flood. So it's basically pretty good. Next slide. And here is a side channel, and this is during the flood on the top and after the flood afterwards. And the restoration ecologists and engineers working on this site and ensure the design accommodated extreme events. So next slide. So this is an example of one which didn't work. So here you had about a meter's worth of sediment come in from the upper end carried by that large flood as the storm eroded banks and moved material downstream. There's a fish biologist attempting to dig out what's called a pit tag antenna, passive induced transponder. It's an antenna for tracking the side channel use by juvenile salmon and steelhead. And so basically going forward, you have to think about how you design habitat enhancements like side channels. Do you accept that some of them are going to get destroyed while maybe new ones are created? Or do you only create alcoves and other features that are protected from such storms? Or do you have a portfolio of habitats, some exposed, some protected? So, you know, this partly depends on the situation and how much of a floodplain exists. There isn't much in the case of Dry Creek because there's vineyards right up next to the creek. So these are some of the challenges that the restoration ecologists and engineers are wrestling with down in California. So next slide. So moving on to a slightly larger scale. So the Trinity River, if you look on the lower left part of this slide, it'll give you an orientation. Trinity River is in Northern California, pretty close to Oregon. And in 1962, the Trinity River was dammed and 90% of its flow was diverted. Instead of flowing out to the coast in the Pacific Ocean, it was diverted into the Sacramento River Basin for irrigation of agricultural land in the Central Valley. There was some power production as well. And that diversion led to an 80% decline in the abundance of Chinook salmon, similar declines in other fish species. So after 20 years of research and 11 lawsuits, they came to what's called in the US a record of decision, or ROD. It was signed in 2000 and was an effort to restore the Trinity River, essentially to a river half its original size with half of the original pre-dam inflows, using channel rehabilitation, flow manipulation, additions of gravel. So you can see those three actions in the pictures. The top two pictures there show how vegetation encroached upon the channel, and part of the idea was to bulldoze back that vegetation, create more of a floodplain, and then adjust flows that would help to eliminate recruitment of vegetation along those floodplain surfaces, and also move gravel downstream and also keep enough cold temperatures for salmon. Okay, next slide. So I pretty well already covered this slide, but it's a better map. So you can see in the upper right area, there are two reservoirs, Trinity Lake and Lewiston Lake, the smaller reservoir. Trinity Lake's the main one. And then the Trinity River flows to the southwest and then up to the northwest, eventually joins the Klamath River at the very top left there near the Yurok Indian Reservation sign. And the Yurok and Hoopa Valley were basically the First Nations, or tribes as they called in the US, who initiated all these lawsuits because their right to have continued fishing had been taken away by the creation of the dams. Next slide. So on the left side of this diagram, you see an undammed natural basin, and you have historic spawning reaches high up where, you know, salmon tend to swim as high up as they can. And then you have a connected floodplain, and that allows for the creation and evolution of habitats that salmon use. Now, when you have a dam on the right side of this, you're eliminating the supply of gravel. So the spawning reaches downstream of the dam, particularly just below it, tend to degrade. That is, they decrease in their elevation. And then, of course, because there aren't as many big floods, agriculture and other land uses move in, and generally you get a more and more channelized stream underneath it. You lose the meanders, the connection to the floodplain. And those spawning reaches up above the dam are, of course, no longer accessible. So next slide. So this is a graph showing the recurrence interval of different peak discharges in the Trinity River. The blue solid lines are pre-1961 at the dam, and then the dashed line is post-1961. And so, you know, if you look at any particular spot on this graph, say if you look at a recurrence interval of 5 years, before the dam was built, there would be, every 5 years would be a flow of about 30,000 cubic feet per second. Afterwards, it's about 2,000 or 3,000. So a really big decline in the power of the stream to move gravel and to do other geomorphological work that rivers do. Lower down, 62 miles below the dam, are the red lines. The effects aren't quite as extreme in a relative sense because other tributaries come in and that are undammed, and this is often the case, is that the effects of dams diminish as you move further downstream with the inflows from other tribs. So next slide. So, so the blue, sorry, I just got my slides on. Yeah, the blue line here, or the blue graph, shows what the flows were like prior to the creation of the dam. And so you would get these very high flow peaks, usually with winter storms, and then snowmelt would generate other flows in April and May. And so the spawning and smolt downstream migration were well adapted to these large flows. And then the yellow little bar at the very bottom is what the flow was like after the dam was put in place, say from mid-1960s to the year 2000. So neither the salmon nor the vegetation you see at the top of this graph have life histories that were attuned to the post-dam conditions. So they're basically trying to recreate some of the pre-dam hydrograph. Next slide.
Can I ask you a question about this hydrograph?
Yeah, sure.
So often when a river is dammed or regulated, what we see is the base flows increase and the peak flows decrease, and just average everything out. But in this case, it looks like there's a vast decrease in the overall amount of water, not just the timing of when it's released. Is that due to evaporation or water withdrawals?
No,
or
that's diversion, right? You remember that 90% of the water was being sent out over to the Central Valley.
Oh, okay, yeah. So they're
right?
damming
That's
it
where
and
it's
taking
gone.
the water and moving it elsewhere. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. So it was a big fight between the irrigators in the Central Valley and the tribes and yeah, other agencies to get the water back. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So it's a pretty extreme experiment, if you want to call it that. So this is what the pre-dam channel looked like. It's an aerial photo. You had gravel bars, which were used for spawning. The outer banks would have faster velocities that would scour away the vegetation, would also add woody debris, which helps create log jams and pools. And then there'd be slower velocities on the inner bank of the meander, which is ideal for fry and juvenile salmon that can't withstand high velocities, and they can hang out there and find refugia from predators and nibble away at whatever food sources there are. So next slide. So now this is what happened after 40 years or so of reduced flows. So the vegetation moved in over those gravel bars. The riparian berms have been armored by now, 1 to 2 foot diameter cottonwood, and that gravel is no longer mobile. It doesn't move down, and this is 40 miles downstream of the dam. So most of the channel has been straightened. It becomes sort of a chute during high flows and a hot solar collector during low flows. So next slide. So this is what they plan to do in the 2000 record of decision. The ecologists attempted to mimic many of the attributes of the pre-dam hydrograph, admittedly with only half the amount of water. And so in every March, they look at the snowpack and determine what kind of water year it is, from critically dry to extremely wet. And then each water year has a distinct allocation of the flow. So in a critically dry year, they actually get the same amount of flow they used to get before the record of decision, but then in other years they get more, and they have a hydrograph peak, and then it gradually declines to allow for riparian vegetation to be fed water and root systems to grow and to maintain a minimum flow for fish temperatures. Whereas the peak is made to move gravel downstream and have other geomorphic objectives established or achieved, rather. Next slide. So what's been happening with climate change? Well, if you look at the top, this was from the record of decision. This was the frequency of critically dry, normal, wet, and extremely wet years. And it's not really a long enough time series to be able to say exactly how things have been changing, but what's been happening is that's really important is the sequences. So the droughts that they had during 2006 to 2009, and then again 2013 to 2015, while not unprecedented, they drained the Trinity Reservoir down to its lowest level. So it's kind of like a gambler who can withstand losing one hand occasionally, but if he or she loses 4 or 5 hands in a row, they're in deep trouble. And if 2016, if you look at the very bottom, had also been a dry year, there would have been no more cold water left in the reservoir, and the salmon would have suffered from excessively high temperatures in the river. But fortunately, after 3 dry years, well, 2 dry years and 1 critically dry year, in 2016, they were dealt a good hand. So next slide. So December 2015 had the second lowest level in the Trinity Lake Reservoir since it was filled. That's where the red arrow is. And that's where things were getting quite worrisome. And then the storm came, the same storm that hit Dry Creek and refilled the reservoir. Next slide. So the satellite image on the left shows how much of the area of the reservoir shrank in 2015 and how much it recovered after the floods of late 2016 and early 2017. So climate change forces us to deal with extremes that are very rapidly changing, as I said earlier, from drought to floods. And that creates big challenges for water managers. Next slide. So, what they're trying to do in the Trinity River is in wet years, take advantage of the opportunity for the river to do work, sculpt new side channels. This example on the left side of this slide, move gravel, erode banks, add large woody debris and gravel. And then in dry years, just try to get through them. On the right side, you can see an example where they have solar-powered panels to do drip irrigation of an area above a dredge spoil site. And they're looking at other solutions to try to make use of groundwater, particularly in dry years, to allow the vegetation to survive, because they won't have enough river water to flood the floodplains. Next slide. Okay, so back to your home turf, Okanagan Basin, 21,000 square kilometers. And just a time check, Jerry, we have till 12:15, is that right?
12:20.
Oh, good. Okay, yeah, we're on target then. Yeah, so the Okanagan River flows south from Okanagan Lake, as you all know, joins the Columbia River, and most of the storage for the Okanagan River is provided by Okanagan Lake, and there's some minor additional storage in a few headwater reservoirs. And so sockeye salmon migrate about 1,000 kilometers up from the Pacific through the Columbia River in 9 major hydro projects. This sockeye population is one of only 2 remaining naturally reproducing sockeye stocks on the Columbia River, the others in Lake Wenatchee. So about 30 kilometers downstream from Okanagan Lake is the terminal spawning area for Okanagan River sockeye salmon, which then rear in a Soyuz lake. And so starting in about 2002, my colleagues at ESSA and I worked with a collaborative working group led by Kim Hyatt from DFO to develop a real-time decision tool for managing water flows called the Fish Water Management Tools, or FWMT. So that uses real-time information on snowpack, lake levels, stream temperatures, stream flows to help managers make the best possible decisions on how much water to release from Okanagan Lake to create the best possible flows. So for sockeye, while at the same time meeting objectives for flood control, water supply, navigation, irrigation, and also kokanee fish in Okanagan Lake. So next slide. So the modeling we had done predicted that as a result of using this tool, you might see an increase in smolts of about 50%. However, due to many cumulative effects, including surprisingly high marine survival, the actual increase has been about 600%, as you can see on this graph. And the number of sockeye returning has been a wonderful thing for the Okanagan First Nation. Next slide. So that's good news. Bad news, first set of bad news, 2050 will be a lot drier. So downscaled global circulation model predictions for 2041 to 2070 were used to estimate future inflows to Okanagan Lake, which are shown here as the red line. So those forecasts estimate a 40% reduction in total net inflow, and that intensifies supply-demand tensions, not only for sockeye, but for humans in a rapidly growing area. And peak runoff is expected to be 4 weeks earlier. Next slide. So second piece of bad news is that our models predict that egg to smolt survival is projected to decrease by 44% by 2050. So this shows the distribution of egg to smolt survival over different water years. And the distribution basically shifts to the left with lower egg to smolt survival. Next slide. And the third piece
Can you
of bad
elaborate
news,
on that, actually? Could you elaborate on why that is? Why is that shift predicted?
well, yeah, so
Is that just because the river flows?
the reason is that you have essentially less water available to provide the flows that are required for different life history stages of salmon. So, you know, you need ideally high flows in the fall so that there's enough to attract salmon up to spawn. And then you want to have reasonable flows throughout the winter so that the eggs that have been laid don't desiccate or freeze, right? If the flows drop completely, you have a really dry winter, then the eggs that were laid in the fall are now going to be exposed to the air. And then you need, for maintaining water temperatures, you know, as those eggs hatch, you want to be able to allow those fish to grow and have a good survival to the smolt stage. So when you have very little water, there are a number of things that essentially constrain the ability of water managers to create the flows that are required. That's the short version.
That was going to be my follow-up question, is that controllable by the highly regulated Okanagan system, or is that just beyond their control?
Oh, I mean, there is the dam at in Penticton, right? So they can control the flows unless you have a big flood. They control the flows quite well, but you can't create what you don't have, right? Mm-hmm. So in an extremely dry year, and that's what basically the problem is, you just don't have enough water to maintain the flows that you need. Okay. Yeah. So then, yeah. So I'm just continuing bearer of bad news here. So the third piece of bad news is looking at the rest of the life cycle. In very warm summers like 2015, you can remember we had the forest fires. Well, I'm sure you remember them very well in the Okanagan. So the July temperatures at Bonneville Dam, the first dam that returning sockeye meet on the Columbia River, they were greater than 22 degrees Celsius, which is lethal for salmon. And the numbers on this graph, or this map rather, show the percent of spawners remaining compared to the total which entered the mouth of the Columbia River in 2015, which are the red numbers, and 2016, which are the black numbers. So 100% entering, and then how many are left. So if you look at the very top right of this map, you can see in red that only 2.2% of the returning spawners made it back to Esuias Lake in 2015, as compared to 28% in 2016. So again, climate change brings very high variability from year to year, and to be resilient, you have to somehow be able to cope with that variability. So next slide. So the fourth piece of bad news is the record flooding in Okanagan Lake in May 2017. So on the bottom right is some output from this fish water management tool, which develops or outputs red, yellow, or green traffic lights for different indicators of interest. And you can see there's a lot of red for flood control. And you can see in the photographs above the flooding that occurred. Maybe some of you were there for those floods. So it started out as a pretty normal snowpack, average snowpack, 86% of normal on March 1st. If you look at the lower left part of this slide, then it became high snowpack in April, a record wet year in May, as a Pineapple Express dropped enormous quantities of rain, and even higher in June. So the highest lake levels in 200 years. And so, you know, the tool that we were using, it kind of missed this. So the fish water management tool selects historical water years based on a statistical matching algorithm to predict total cumulative inflow. But when you're outside the historical record, any historical year that you predict isn't going to be accurate. So we have to move the historical record. And so new algorithms are required, which sample from finely downscaled future scenarios and use early warning indicators, which look at snowpack, precipitation, groundwater, to assess on a day-by-day basis the risk of extreme events, because essentially moving beyond historical records. So we have to look at just what's going on. Next slide. So in developing, if you go in the literature, like this Desai and Hume paper 2004 on climate change adaptation, they talk about top-down approaches as well as bottom-up approaches. And so in developing this fish water management decision support tool, we started with a bottom-up approach. We assessed social, economic, ecological vulnerabilities. When would the system break? As well as opportunities, and the model is a collection of hypotheses. And then for looking forward under around 2050, we used downscaled forecasts of precipitation and temperature to assess what conditions might exist then. So starting up with a bottom-up approach in a decision analysis framework can help to clarify exactly what you need from a top-down approach. And if you Google CRIDA, C-R-I-D-A, that's an approach to decision analysis which uses climate change as an impetus for assessing, when various systems would break. And that's a pretty good, they got a nice handbook there. Next slide. So moving up to the Platte River Basin. The Platte is a river which starts in Wyoming and Colorado. That's where the headwaters are. Travels about 1,500 kilometers before joining the Missouri River. And there's a project which I've been involved with for about 15 years to restore habitat for endangered birds, terns, plovers, and whooping cranes, while at the same time not doing any damage to pallid sturgeon, another endangered species. So early on this program, they had two alternative hypotheses about how to do this, how to create habitat for birds. So the bottom left, the idea there, promoted most strongly by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, was to use flow and sediment, like adding gravel or sand rather to the river, to have the river build sandbars. And the second approach, which was promoted by some of the power entities that didn't want to give up their water, said, let's just use off-channel sand pits, because there's lots of places where they mine sand, adjacent to the river as nesting habitat. So, in rivers like the Missouri River, as you'll see, big flows do create habitat, but the Platte River is has a much wider, let's say, width to depth ratio. It's very, very shallow, very wide. And what ended up happening is, in recent years, that very big storms happened and the high flows essentially washed away all the sandbars, either naturally created or mechanically created by bulldozers. And all of the bird nesting is occurring on these off-channel sand pits, which you can see in the middle picture at the bottom. They're essentially like bird zoos, but they work. And so the increased variability of flows has actually provided a powerful natural experiment to test adaptive management hypotheses. So if you go to the next slide. So one of the hypotheses, which was promoted strongly by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, was that if you could do 3 days of flow at 5,000 to 8,000 cubic feet per second, which is the range shown in the blue rectangle on this graph. This is a log scale graph, that would build sandbars suitable for bird nesting. So they couldn't actually create exactly that same flow, 5,000, 8,000 CFS for 3 days, because they didn't have a reservoir with enough storage to make a release exactly like that. But they had 7 natural flow events, the red ellipses on this diagram, on this graph, which were of equal or greater magnitude and duration, and allowed scientists to test that hypothesis and reject it and say, no, this just doesn't work. And it's very hard for people to give up their treasured hypotheses. And it took some persuading, but eventually they did come around. And the bottom line is that variability in flows due to extreme events can test flow hypotheses beyond the range that managers can create. So they do provide an opportunity. And parenthetically, the Platte may now be heading into another dry period, so there's different kinds of challenges that they'll have to face. Next slide. Okay, so we're moving along at a good pace here. Onto our last example, the Missouri River. So 1.4 million square kilometers, and has 2 of the same species of concern that we have in the Platte, the piping plovers and least terns. Pallid sturgeon are a very big focus in the Missouri River. And this is the second largest basin in the continental US next to the Mississippi. It's a part of the Mississippi Basin. It's actually the longest river. So next slide. So we're moving up to a big scale here, and one of the challenges is meeting both the species needs and what are so-called human considerations, or basically the human needs. And when these 5 major dams and reservoirs on the Missouri were built back in the 1940s, they had various designated purposes, including flood control and power production and agriculture and so on. And so there's a process involving 75 stakeholders, and you can see some of the different interests that are represented there in that long list. There are 2 representatives for each of those interests, and then there are 16 total. Then there's 29 First Nations or tribes, there's 8 states, 9 federal government agencies. That's how you make up 75 people. And most of the folks, not everybody, are very nervous about any changes in flow management to benefit the listed species. You can see why with that picture of a big flood on the Missouri River in 2011. And that was the subject of a major lawsuit against the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Next slide. And this is the fellow Roger Eidecker on the road to his farm in Missouri, who was the lead plaintiff in that lawsuit against the Corps of Engineers. And this is interesting because it sort of contrasts 2 paradigms. The plaintiffs argue that legislatively, the Corps has a responsibility for flood control. And the Army Corps says that all they can actually do is reduce the risk of floods. They don't control how much water comes from the sky or how much snow melts. And eventually the Corps won that lawsuit, but it's a very big challenge in science communication to separate out the effects of the Army Corps that runs these dams from natural events, and to be able to separate the causes of changes that occur. So next slide. So unlike in the Platte River, big flows in the Missouri do create sandbars that are suitable for nesting birds. So it wasn't great for farms, but if you look at that green line, the amount of emergent sandbar habitat went up about 14-fold after the 2011 flood, and far more than what the target requirement is given the population. So if you move to the next slide then. So the challenge, and this is shown here for sandbar habitat, but it applies equally to the fish situation, is there an overlap or a sort of usable decision space between what is effective for the species, and that's the blue polygon in the upper right. So you need essentially larger flows for longer duration to actually benefit the species. And the orange polygon at the lower left, which represents the flow magnitudes and duration which might be acceptable to stakeholders. So are there some green dots or green area in the middle that might serve both the needs of the species as well as the needs of the people? And it's much more difficult to find that overlap when you have a 75-person stakeholder group than if you have a small group like, say, in Dry Creek of about 10 to 15 people. Next slide. So it's kind of summing up now, and I'll have some time for questions. So these are some of the challenges across the 5 basins that I've just presented to you. So extreme runoff and flow events, which have had effects on habitat and property. On the flip side, longer periods of drought, which have negative effects on biota. And the third is that the scale of climatic impacts and required intervention are often much larger than the scale of where the managers are operating. So the solutions to, for example, the Trinity River problems require looking at the Sacramento Basin as well as the Trinity River Basin and what decisions are made there. And that, you know, as soon as you move to a larger scale, that makes things more difficult. So next slide. So here's some, here's some of the strategies that can be used to adapt to climate change in the case of these 5 case studies. And if you read down the left-hand column, using variability in flow to test flow habitat hypotheses. The most concrete example is the Platte, but it's also been applied elsewhere. Using real-time decision support systems to manage flows. I went into some detail on the Okanagan Fishwater Management Tool. That's just one example. Developing advanced systems for anomaly detection and flood forecasting from weather. They're doing that in Dry Creek and the Okanagan River, actually now in the Missouri as well. Increasing storage, dams, groundwater, wetland ponds to reduce the impacts of drought. So I didn't really go through that, but that is a way to create a bit more of a savings account in your bank to deal with variability. Obviously, if the Trinity River had had a smaller reservoir, Trinity Lake is quite large, they wouldn't have been able to get through the 3 years of drought. The next one is rethinking and redesigning habitat restoration for greater resilience during droughts and floods. So you can think of that a little bit like a stock portfolio, right? If your only stock were Apple, you've probably done pretty well, but you may not continue indefinitely to do well. So, having a mutual fund or a set of mutual funds that buffer you against changes in different directions provides greater resilience. Implementing actions to reduce water demand. There's a lot of work that's been done in the Okanagan Basin on that, and a lot of work done in California. One of the ironic things is in Sonoma County, where we were working on Dry Creek, they got people to reduce their water consumption by about half. They had a huge campaign, all sorts of incentives and so on. But then what ended up happening is the per liter or per gallon cost of water went up, because essentially you have the same infrastructure costs distributed across a smaller volume that's being distributed. So the people were not too happy about that. Hey, we've done all our bits and now we're having to pay, well, it wasn't more in total, but basically a lot more per gallon. And so how to do that, in a way that's pragmatic is a challenge. And lastly, the bottom row there is revising basin-wide water management strategies to meet species needs and accommodate increased variability in flows. And that's being done across all of those 5 basins. So next slide, we're almost done here. So this is a slide where we compare watersheds with little or no upstream storage on the left side with watersheds like the Trinity or the Okanagan or the Missouri with large upstream storage. So the blue ovals are the range of flows under historical climate with magnitude on the x-axis and duration on the y-axis. So if you look at the graph on the left, this is a watershed with little or no upstream storage. As you move to climate change, which is the yellow oval, you see a big increase in flow variability. So more extreme droughts, that is at the extreme lower left of that graph, and more extreme floods at the extreme upper right. Then if you move over to the right-hand graph, so a place like the Trinity with a large upstream storage, that storage reduced the size of the blue oval a lot. So if you move from the left side before they created those dams, there was a lot more flow variability, and the dams reduced that, and also the diversion. And so climate change is actually increasing the variability a bit more, let's say, closer to the variability that might have existed prior to the dam's construction. So in some ways, when talking to some of the people down there, they say, you know, climate change isn't all bad because we're getting some really big flows that we really need to do the geomorphic work in the river, and we weren't getting those previously. So that's just a, you know, there's pros and cons, I guess what I'd say. Next slide. So 3 key points. Climate change demands an adaptive management mindset. Both adaptive management and adapting to climate change gets harder as the spatial scale increases. And climate change brings challenges, but also opportunities for learning and adaptation. And I just added this slide, a quote on the lower left about organizational resilience, because the bottom line of all of this is increasing resilience in multiple organizations. So federal, provincial, municipal, indigenous governments, non-government organizations, corporations, having greater resilience to greater extremes of conditions is key. And last slide is a cartoon. So happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. That was a super interesting talk and some great applications of adaptive management. I will just close by thanking you again and saying I really appreciated it. And I will follow up with you afterwards and maybe get a couple of recommendations for a few of your papers that I'll post on our Canvas site so that people can look into adaptive management a little bit more deeply. So lots of people
Actually,
just popping in things.
Jerry,
Yep.
just remember, if you advance one more slide, there's a bunch of papers on the last slide there. So
perfect. I'll
yeah.
I know I've got a couple of these already, so I'll post a couple of these.
There's more. There's quite. I'll forward to you. There's a link on our website where you can get quite a few.
Cool. All right. Well, thanks again.
Well, nice to see you again, Jerry, and all
Yeah.
the best to you and all the students, and hope you folks have a lot of fun exploring these ideas.
And send your resumes to Dave when you graduate.